It began in the cold, black waters of the North Atlantic, an empty, wind-torn expanse where no armies marched, no flags waved, and no front lines existed. Yet in this desolate place the fate of the modern world hung by a thread. Long before the beaches of Normandy, long before the Allies dared envision victory, Britain stood on the brink of starvation, its lifeline strangled one torpedo at a time. The battle was quiet, invisible, and merciless. It was a war of shadows fought beneath the waves, and for a terrifying moment, it was a war Britain was losing. As 1940 dawned, Britain appeared, at least on maps, to still command a global empire. But maps lie. What the British Empire truly depended on was not territory but tonnage, the endless flow of merchant ships hauling food, oil, steel, and weapons from across the oceans. Without that supply line, the island kingdom was nothing more than a besieged fortress, one that German U-boats now encircled with tightening precision. Winston Churchill understood this more clearly than anyone, confessing later that the only thing that truly frightened him during the war was the U-boat threat. His fear was not theatrical, it was mathematical. If Britain lost too many ships each month, its people would starve, its factories would fall idle, and its armies, wherever they fought, would simply cease to exist. Germany knew this as well. In the first months of the war, while the world watched armies clash in Poland and France, Admiral Karl Dönitz watched shipping charts. He believed Britain could be defeated without a single German soldier setting foot on her shores. All he needed was enough submarines, hundreds of them operating in coordinated wolf packs that could tear apart convoys faster than Britain could replace them. The German High Command never fully grasped how close Dönitz was to being right. In truth, he began the war with too few boats to deliver the death blow, but even those few were enough to push Britain toward the edge. The danger was heightened by Britain's own unpreparedness. Despite lessons from World War I, British naval doctrine in 1939 still suffered from caution, outdated assumptions, and painful shortages. Convoys were mandatory in theory but slow to organize in practice. Radar was primitive, sonar unreliable above high seas, and air cover almost non-existent across the mid-Atlantic gap, the vast, storm-lashed region beyond the reach of land-based aircraft. It was here, in this void, that the U-boats became predators and the merchant ships their prey. Early convoy commanders faced a nightmare of limited visibility, monstrous waves, and outdated tactics. Many had never encountered a submarine before. The men on merchant ships, often civilians barely trained for war, sailed knowing that at any moment without warning their hull could erupt in a plume of water and flame. Survivors often described the first second after an explosion as a moment of surreal silence. The lights going out, the deck tilting, the cold rushing in, and then the groan of steel as the ship surrendered to the sea. For the crews of the U-boats, the war looked different but was no less brutal. They lived packed into narrow steel tubes, the air damp, the smell of oil and sweat ever present. Days blurred into nights, and sleep came in short, broken increments. They fought in silence, stalking their targets through periscope lenses, firing a spread of torpedoes, then slipping away beneath the waves before escorts could retaliate. It was a war without glory, fatal, intimate, and claustrophobic. Throughout 1940 and into 1941, Britain's situation grew steadily worse. The fall of France had given Germany key Atlantic ports in Bordeaux, Lorient, and Brest, new nests for U-boats and bases from which their range dramatically increased. Now they could strike deeper into the Atlantic, hit more convoys, and retreat to well-fortified shelters carved from concrete. Meanwhile, the Royal Navy stretched itself thin, guarding not only the Atlantic routes, but also the Mediterranean, the Indian Ocean, and distant colonial waters. For every escort ship Britain deployed, the Germans added more submarines. The arithmetic of the Atlantic began to tilt dangerously. The most chilling indicator was the tonnage loss rate. British analysts calculated that if merchant losses exceeded roughly 750,000 tons per month, Britain's war machine would collapse. By early 1941, the Germans were approaching that number. Each sunken ship was more than just steel. It was the bread of Londoners, the fuel of RAF squadrons, the ammunition of soldiers in North Africa. And the U-boats showed no signs of slowing. The convoy system itself struggled under immense stress. Escorts were too few and frequently outdated. Some ships still used World War I-era depth charges with limited effectiveness. Poor coordination between the Royal Navy and Royal Air Force hindered any unified strategy. German wolf pack tactics exploited these weaknesses mercilessly. When a U-boat spotted a convoy, it shadowed it, sending encrypted messages to others. Soon, under cover of night, the U-boats preferred hunting time. A coordinated assault began. Torpedoes from multiple directions overwhelmed the escorts. Panic, confusion, and radio silence only made the slaughter faster. The mid-Atlantic gap loomed as the deadliest zone. Convoys entering it lost their air protection and became blind, exposed, and desperately vulnerable. Some sailors called it the Black Pit, a place where you sailed knowing you might never come out. The U-boats knew it too. They waited there like wolves at a watering hole, confident the prey could not escape. In London, the War Cabinet received increasingly grim reports. Food rationing tightened. The Admiralty scrambled to produce new escort ships, shipyards worked around the clock, and Canada expanded its naval production dramatically. But it was not enough, not yet. Britain had begun the war with an illusion of naval supremacy. Reality was proving harsher. The Royal Navy still possessed massive battle fleets, heavy cruisers and aircraft carriers, but none of those mattered in the vast mid-ocean where submarines, not battleships, were king. In this unforgiving theater, the war depended on the small and often overlooked corvettes, sloops, and destroyer escorts, ships that turned slowly, rolled violently in storms, and lacked the glamour of their larger counterparts. Yet they were all that stood between Britain and starvation. Behind these events, technology became a silent protagonist. Enigma, Germany's supposedly unbreakable cipher, allowed U-boats to coordinate with deadly precision. British cryptanalysts at Bletchley Park were racing against time to crack it, and at this early stage they could not read enough messages fast enough to change the tide. Britain's coastal command aircraft lacked range, while American long-range patrol planes had not yet entered the war. And in Berlin, Dönitz pushed relentlessly for more submarines, believing that a fleet of 300 operational U-boats would bring Britain to her knees. If he had received them earlier, the outcome of the Atlantic could have been devastating. By 1941, the situation sharpened further with Germany's introduction of new tactics and technology. The U-boats began using Metox radar detectors to avoid Allied patrols. They deployed faster torpedo-firing procedures and improved night surface attacks. Meanwhile, Britain's escorts often sailed blind, relying on sound detection that was easily disrupted by storm conditions, engine noise, or the U-boat's silent running. The Atlantic seemed to conspire against the Allies. Thick fogs, towering waves, icy swells, and constant gales. Men stationed on open decks could be soaked for days, frozen to the bone. Ships struggled simply to maintain formation, let alone evade torpedoes. Amid this growing chaos, morale on both sides fluctuated wildly. U-boat crews celebrated daring successes, returning to Germany as heroes, while British sailors endured frustration and grief. Survivors pulled from lifeboats often spoke of the haunting silence after a ship went down, the sight of debris drifting across moonlit water, the cries fading one by one as hypothermia claimed the stranded. Merchant sailors, many from far-flung corners of the empire or neutral nations, faced one of the highest casualty rates of the war. Their struggle rarely appeared in headlines, but their courage kept Britain alive. Still, despite mounting losses, Britain refused to admit defeat. Every convoy that limped into port brought the island a little more time. Every new escort built, every new corvette commissioned added another stitch to the fragile seam holding Britain together. The Royal Navy reorganized its tactics, improved training, and began integrating intelligence from new sources. But in the tense early years of the Battle of the Atlantic, time seemed to favor the hunter beneath the waves. The German U-boat arm was expanding, refining, and growing more confident by the month. The final pressure point, the moment when Britain nearly buckled, was about to arrive. And when it did, the Atlantic would become the most decisive battleground of the entire war. not through grand invasions or roaring tanks, but through the desperate struggle to keep a lifeline open across a merciless sea. By the spring of 1941, the magnitude of the threat became undeniable. U-boats prowled in ever-increasing numbers, coordinating strikes that could decimate entire convoys in hours. The Kriegsmarine's wolf pack tactics, once theoretical, proved devastating in practice. A single sighting by one submarine could summon half a dozen others from hundreds of miles away. Convoy HX-112, sailing from Halifax to Liverpool in March 1941, became an early illustration of the peril. Of its 40 ships, 6 were sunk in a matter of days, and escorts were hard-pressed to respond. Each loss, each overturned hull, echoed across the British Isles as food and fuel failed to arrive, feeding both anxiety and urgency in equal measure. The stakes were existential. Britain's insular geography provided some natural defense, but it also rendered the nation utterly dependent on the sea. Unlike continental powers, Britain could not forage for oil or coal beyond its borders, and its own production of food and raw materials was woefully inadequate. Ships were the arteries of the empire, and Germany sought to sever them completely. To do so, Dönitz did not need to conquer land. He only needed to count tonnage, calculate losses, and maintain pressure long enough for hunger and despair to do what bombs could not. In this numerical war, each merchant ship became a soldier, and each sunk vessel a casualty of strategic arithmetic. The Atlantic became an arena of improvisation and innovation. The Royal Navy experimented with convoys of varying sizes, escort formations, and zigzag maneuvers designed to confuse U-boat targeting. Yet for every measure Britain took, the Germans devised countermeasures. Surface attacks by destroyers were rare in the open ocean, and reliance on sonar and hydrophones could not compensate for the U-boat's stealth, particularly during night attacks when moonless nights became allies to German submariners. Air reconnaissance helped, but the long-range patrol planes of Coastal Command could not cover the central Atlantic, creating a persistent air gap where U-boats could strike with near impunity. The human cost was extraordinary. Merchant crews faced the bitter cold, the ceaseless threat of torpedoes, and the constant motion of rolling decks. Many had never seen combat before, yet their role was critical to survival. Stories emerged of extraordinary bravery, sailors diving into icy waters to rescue comrades, maintaining discipline amid chaos, and managing damaged ships under fire. On the other side, U-boat crews endured the stifling claustrophobia of submarine life, often submerged for days, with limited food and air, hearing only the distant thrum of depth charges and the ocean pressing against steel. Both sides lived in an environment where fatigue and fear were constant companions, and yet the operational tempo never eased. The winter of 1940-1942 was particularly punishing. Atlantic storms battered convoys, causing structural damage and scattering ships across hundreds of miles. Navigation became perilous, and mechanical failures were common. Escorts had to rescue men from lifeboats as much as defend against the enemy. Convoy OB 293, a mixed assembly of freighters and tankers, illustrates this reality. A storm separated many ships, leaving them vulnerable, and the following night German U-boats attacked relentlessly. The result was a mixture of loss, survival, and harrowing endurance, all unseen by the public, whose newspapers could not fully capture the human drama unfolding at sea. Meanwhile, British intelligence slowly gained ground. Signals from Enigma-encoded communications began to yield patterns. Analysts at Bletchley Park, working in secrecy and under immense pressure, started providing strategic insights, allowing convoys to reroute or reinforce vulnerable sectors. The first glimmers of hope appeared not from the gun barrels of battleships, but from minds deciphering codes, linking intelligence, and anticipating enemy movements. Still, these advances were piecemeal, and for months, the effect on the actual battle was limited. U-boats continued to claim hundreds of thousands of tons of shipping, and the logistical strain on Britain intensified. Technology on both sides escalated rapidly. The Germans tested acoustic homing torpedoes and improved radio direction finding, while the Allies experimented with long-range radar, lee lights for night patrols, and rudimentary escort carriers. Small warships like corvettes and frigates became frontline assets, armed with depth charges, hedgehog mortars, and ASDIC sonar. Every new technological improvement shifted the balance slightly, yet the battle remained as much about endurance and human determination as it did about engineering. The psychological weight on Britain was immense. Londoners knew that food, fuel, and clothing depended on whether ships arrived. Every loss brought anxiety and rationing. Every successful arrival provided temporary relief. Winston Churchill famously remarked that the Battle of the Atlantic was the dominating factor all through the war, and for good reason. The entire British war effort from North Africa to Burma relied on these lifelines. For months, it was a test of resolve, with the public largely unaware of how perilously close the nation came to being cut off entirely. Despite adversity, Britain adapted. Convoys became better coordinated, escort training improved, and long-range air coverage slowly extended from Newfoundland and Scotland. Canadian shipyards became crucial production hubs, churning out corvettes and destroyers at a rate unmatched by the Kriegsmarine. Merchant mariners were increasingly armed, and naval gunners learned to respond to torpedo attacks with more accuracy and coordination. This incremental learning process, however, came at a staggering cost, with entire crews and ships lost before the benefits could fully manifest. The arrival of the United States as an arsenal of democracy in 1941 also shifted the strategic landscape. Even before formally entering the war, American shipbuilding and convoy escort support bolstered Britain's fragile logistics. Liberty ships, though basic, were produced in record numbers, designed to replace lost tonnage faster than German submarines could destroy it. American destroyers and aircraft further extended the reach of Allied patrols, gradually eroding the U-boat's operational advantage. Nevertheless, in the early months, the Atlantic remained a vast killing field, where German submarines hunted with impunity and the island nation clung precariously to survival. The relentless attrition tested commanders at every level. Admiral Sir Dudley Pound and his staff faced near-impossible calculations: how many convoys could be protected, which routes to prioritize, and where to concentrate scarce escorts. Every decision carried weighty consequences, and errors often cost hundreds of lives. On the German side, Dönitz's philosophy of aggressive persistence became doctrine, emphasizing that only sustained pressure would force Britain to capitulate. His strategy, though rational on paper, relied on careful coordination, technological precision, and unbroken morale among crews, all of which would eventually be challenged by Allied adaptation. It was a war defined by tension, endurance, and small margins. Every convoy that arrived intact represented not just a tactical success, but a victory of human will against seemingly insurmountable odds. Yet the Atlantic was unforgiving. The line between survival and annihilation was razor-thin, and for months, Britain lived in a suspended state of peril. Each sailor, each officer, each convoy commander played a critical role in a struggle where luck, courage, and perseverance often outweighed firepower. The year 1942 would see the battle escalate even further, as Germany introduced new submarine types, refined tactics, and extended operations to the Caribbean and beyond. Britain's survival depended increasingly on innovation, intelligence, and the growing industrial might of its allies. The mid-Atlantic gap remained deadly, but with each convoy, lessons were learned, methods refined, and the seeds of eventual victory quietly sown. At this stage, however, the threat remained existential. Losses were catastrophic, morale was tested daily, and the question of whether Britain could continue to endure hung over the nation like a storm cloud. By mid-1942, the Atlantic had become a theater of unrelenting intensity, a place where statistics could kill as efficiently as bullets. U-boat commanders honed their craft, stalking convoys with uncanny patience. They often waited for hours beneath choppy waters, relying on periscope sightings and radio coordination to strike with lethal precision. The wolf packs had evolved into a near-industrial hunting mechanism, each submarine a cog in a network designed to maximize destruction. For the men aboard the merchant ships, the experience was harrowing. Each sonar ping, each distant shadow, could mean the difference between survival and the cold embrace of the Atlantic. For many, life had become a continuous vigil, punctuated by moments of terror that seemed to stretch endlessly. The German strategy was clear: sink more tonnage than Britain could replace. In June 1942 alone, U-boats destroyed over 500,000 tons of Allied shipping. The losses were not just numbers, they represented vital food for civilians, fuel for aircraft and ships, and raw materials essential for war production. Each sunken ship reverberated across Britain, triggering rationing, anxiety, and the constant dread that supply lines could be severed entirely. Families inland might have remained unaware of the precise dangers at sea, yet their survival rested on the courage and endurance of sailors braving the North Atlantic, the Caribbean, and the shipping lanes of the South Atlantic. Amid this peril, technological innovation became both a lifeline and a source of hope. Britain invested in radar-equipped aircraft, sonar improvements, and the development of escort carriers capable of patrolling beyond the traditional range of land-based air forces. Each innovation represented a delicate balance: the need for speed, protection, and detection against the relentless efficiency of the U-boat threat. Yet even with these advances, victory was far from certain. The Atlantic remained vast, and the U-boats continued to exploit the open spaces, preying on the blind spots of convoys and the limitations of Allied detection. By late 1942, the human dimension of the struggle became increasingly evident. Merchant seamen, naval gunners, and convoy escorts faced an ever-present tension between fear and duty. Accounts from survivors describe nights spent in lifeboats amid ice and wind, staring at the water as torpedoed ships sank around them, knowing that rescue might take hours or never come at all. The mental toll was immense. Yet these individuals, often ordinary men and women, were performing extraordinary acts of endurance. Their courage, largely uncelebrated, formed the backbone of Britain's survival, providing the necessary time and space for strategic adjustments and technological interventions to take effect. The U-boat crews themselves were under immense pressure. Life in a submarine was a trial of claustrophobia and monotony, punctuated by moments of explosive danger. Officers and men lived in conditions of near-permanent dampness and cold, sharing minimal space and rations, yet maintaining rigorous operational discipline. The Germans relied on the skill, nerve, and persistence of these crews to execute complex, coordinated attacks. In many ways, the Atlantic was a theater of psychological endurance as much as tactical ingenuity, where the stakes for both hunter and prey were existential. By 1943, the balance began to shift, slowly but decisively. Several factors converged to challenge the U-boat threat. First, Allied codebreakers at Bletchley Park made increasingly significant progress in decrypting Enigma messages, providing critical intelligence on U-boat positions and convoy interception points. Second, long-range aircraft, including Liberators and Catalina flying boats, began closing the mid-Atlantic gap, offering air cover where none had existed before. Third, the rapid expansion of escort fleets, particularly corvettes, frigates, and destroyers, improved convoy protection, reducing losses per voyage. And fourth, technological improvements in sonar, radar, and depth charge delivery enhanced the effectiveness of Allied anti-submarine warfare. Together, these measures gradually eroded the U-boat's operational advantage. Nevertheless, the struggle remained brutal. Convoys continued to encounter deadly attacks, often losing ships in horrific circumstances. The interplay between technology, human endurance, and the sheer randomness of survival created a narrative of constant suspense. Men who survived one engagement were not guaranteed safety in the next. Storms, mechanical failure, or a single missed detection could spell disaster. Britain's survival remained precarious, and the shadow of defeat lingered over strategic planners and civilians alike. Even as Allied fortunes began to improve, Dönitz persisted with his doctrine of attrition. His strategy relied on relentless pressure and the belief that sustained losses would eventually overwhelm Britain's industrial and psychological capacity. Yet the tide was turning. Each conv that arrived with minimal losses strengthened Britain's resolve, while technological gains and improved coordination began to tip the scales in the Allies' favor. The Battle of the Atlantic, though far from over, had begun to transform from an existential threat into a contest of attritional advantage, where strategy, intelligence, and logistics increasingly defined the outcome. The story of Britain nearly losing the Atlantic War is not only one of strategy and technology, but also of resilience and adaptation. It is a testament to the courage of ordinary men in extraordinary circumstances, of planners who could calculate risk and response under intense pressure, and of societies that endured scarcity and fear without surrendering their will. In this vast, dark theater of wind and water, the Atlantic itself became a silent witness to humanity at its most vulnerable and its most determined. The early months of 1943 brought a stark realization. While Britain was no longer on the immediate brink of collapse, the U-boat menace remained formidable. Losses, though mitigated by new tactics and intelligence breakthroughs, were still high, and the pressure on production and logistics never abated. The tonnage war continued, a silent, unglamorous struggle that determined the fate of nations. Each convoy crossing the Atlantic became a tense exercise in coordination, patience, and endurance. Admirals and captains learned to read patterns, anticipate attacks, and exploit intelligence from code breakers, while crews on the decks of corvettes, frigates, and destroyers braced for sudden death beneath dark waves. One of the most significant turning points came with the integration of long-range air support. Aircraft no longer merely patrolled coastal waters, they extended over the central Atlantic, filling the notorious air gap that had so long allowed U-boats to operate with near impunity. Liberator bombers, equipped with radar and lee lights, could locate submarines at night, forcing them to dive or risk destruction. This transformed the hunting grounds, shifting the psychological burden onto German crews who now faced threats both above and below the surface. No longer could they attack with impunity. Every surface approach became a calculated risk. Allied air patrols introduced a new element of visibility in a previously opaque battlefield, and the balance began to tip. Meanwhile, the industrial might of the Allies began to assert itself. American shipyards turned out Liberty ships in unprecedented numbers, replacing lost tonnage faster than the Germans could sink it. Canada's naval shipbuilding effort expanded, providing corvettes and escorts in numbers that allowed convoys to travel with greater protection. Innovations such as the Hedgehog anti-submarine mortar and improved sonar systems increased the lethality of escorts, giving them a fighting chance against the stealth and speed of the U-boats. Training improved and experience accumulated, gradually transforming what had once been uncoordinated defensive efforts into a sophisticated, adaptive strategy. Despite these improvements, the Atlantic remained a crucible of endurance. Merchant seamen and naval crews endured storms that could capsize a ship or drive it off course, mechanical failures that rendered a vessel defenseless, and sudden, terrifying attacks that could claim entire crews in minutes. Rescue operations were fraught with danger. Attempting to save survivors often exposed escort ships to further attacks. Life at sea was a constant negotiation between survival and duty, with courage measured in the ability to continue through cold, fear, and exhaustion. The psychological toll cannot be overstated. Men who survived one engagement were acutely aware that the next could be their last. The human dimension was mirrored in the German command, where Dönitz faced his own mounting pressures. Attrition began to take its toll on experienced U-boat crews, and the quality of replacements declined as the war stretched on. Technological countermeasures introduced by the Allies, radar detection, improved depth charges, air patrols, eroded operational effectiveness. Donitz's strategy required near-perfect coordination, but the Atlantic had grown into a more hostile and unforgiving environment. Submarines that once hunted at will now face detection, counterattack, and loss at unprecedented rates. The very tactics that had brought early success were increasingly challenged by adaptation, innovation, and sheer numbers. By mid-1943, the tide had shifted decisively. Convoys began to arrive with significantly reduced losses, and U-boat attrition became unsustainable. June 1943 marked the climax of the Battle of the Atlantic. In that month alone, German submarines suffered catastrophic losses, signaling that the balance of power had turned. Britain could now rely on a more secure flow of supplies, allowing the nation to sustain itself, support overseas campaigns, and build momentum toward eventual large-scale operations in Europe. The industrial, technological, and human resilience that had been cultivated under extreme pressure now bore fruit, demonstrating the cumulative effect of adaptation, intelligence, and endurance. Yet the narrative of near defeat underscores how fragile Britain's survival had truly been. Only a combination of factors, courageous crews, innovative technology, superior production, and intelligence breakthroughs, prevented the nation from succumbing to the U-boat threat. The Atlantic, once a theater dominated by stealth and death, had been transformed into a contested space where human ingenuity and industrial power could assert dominance. The lessons learned in this maritime struggle resonated throughout the rest of the war, influencing strategies, logistics, and the understanding of modern naval warfare. The psychological and cultural impact of the Battle of the Atlantic cannot be overstated. Britain's near collapse underscored the strategic importance of logistics and maritime control, shaping military planning for decades to come. The heroism of merchant seamen, often overlooked, became emblematic of the broader struggle, ordinary individuals performing extraordinary acts under pressure that no other nation could endure alone. For the Allies, every successful convoy became a symbol of resistance, a tangible reminder that survival was possible even against seemingly insurmountable odds. By the end of 1943, Britain's survival in the Atlantic had become a testament not to luck, but to perseverance, adaptation, and the cumulative effect of human effort. The victory was not dramatic in the conventional sense. There were no triumphant charges, no climactic battles with roaring artillery. Instead, it was a quiet, grinding triumph of endurance over attrition, of coordination over chaos, and of will over relentless pressure. It was the product of countless small acts, sailors keeping watch in freezing conditions, code breakers decoding messages in dimly lit rooms, shipyards laboring night and day to replace losses, all converging to avert a national catastrophe. This period also highlighted the interplay between strategy and human experience. Commanders made critical decisions under immense pressure, balancing the risks of convoy routing with the realities of limited resources. Sailors and crews lived in conditions that tested physical limits and psychological resilience. Civilians endured rationing, shortages, and anxiety over the arrival of supplies. Across these layers, the Battle of the Atlantic revealed that modern warfare was as much about sustaining life and morale as it was about destroying the enemy. Even as 1943 drew to a close, the Atlantic remained dangerous. Isolated U-boats still hunted with lethal precision, storms still challenged navigation, and every crossing was fraught with risk. But Britain had weathered the storm. The lessons learned, the integration of technology, the coordination of convoys, the development of skilled crews, and the strategic use of intelligence had begun to tip the balance decisively. The nation that had once teetered on the edge of starvation now possessed the tools and knowledge to dominate the Atlantic, setting the stage for Allied advances in Europe and beyond. The story of Britain nearly losing the Atlantic War is not merely a story of naval tactics or technological innovation. It is a story of human endurance, resilience, and determination under extreme pressure. It is the chronicle of a nation confronted with annihilation yet refusing to yield, of ordinary individuals performing extraordinary acts, and of a complex interplay between strategy, industry, and courage that ultimately turned the tide of history. As 1944 approached, the Atlantic had become a laboratory of strategy, endurance, and technological evolution. Britain's initial fragility had given way to a cautious confidence, yet the lessons of the preceding years remained fresh. Commanders on both sides had absorbed the costs of error, and the theatre of the Atlantic had proven itself as unforgiving as any battlefield. For every convoy that survived, for every ton of supplies that reached Liverpool or Glasgow, there remained the haunting knowledge that a single miscalculation could reverse months of progress. The ocean was a vast and merciless judge, and the stakes, food, fuel, and survival, were absolute. The Allies increasingly adopted aggressive anti-submarine measures. Escort groups were reorganized into hunter-killer teams, trained to pursue and destroy U-boats rather than merely defend convoys. These groups utilized intelligence from code breakers to anticipate attacks, while aircraft patrolled relentlessly, forcing submarines to submerge for long periods, reducing their speed and operational effectiveness. Coordination between air and sea units became more sophisticated, with radar-equipped planes and sonar-equipped ships combining to create a network of detection that constrained U-boat movements. The psychological impact on German crews was profound. The Atlantic, once their hunting ground, had become a gauntlet. Meanwhile, Britain's industrial and logistical machinery reached unprecedented levels of output. Liberty ships, corvettes, and frigates replaced losses at a pace that outstripped German attacks. Canadian and American shipyards contributed heavily, producing vessels in record numbers, while Britain optimized repair and refitting processes to keep damaged ships operational. Technological innovations, Hedgehog mortars, improved sonar, long-range radar, and directional hydrophones enhanced the lethality of escorts. The Atlantic, which had once been a theater dominated by stealth and surprise, was gradually transformed into a controlled environment where Allied dominance could be asserted incrementally but effectively. Despite these advances, the human element remained decisive. Sailors, gunners, and pilots continued to face conditions that tested endurance and morale. Freezing temperatures, relentless storms, and the constant threat of sudden attack were daily realities. Merchant mariners, often civilians pressed into wartime service, performed acts of extraordinary courage, maintaining course, manning guns, and surviving shipwrecks in lifeboats. The personal stories of resilience were interwoven with the broader strategic picture, illustrating that victory in the Atlantic depended as much on individual courage and perseverance as it did on technology or planning. German U-boat crews, increasingly aware of their vulnerability, faced mounting losses. Experienced officers were lost, and replacements lacked the depth of training that had characterized early campaigns. Dönitz's strategy, predicated on sustained attrition, encountered diminishing returns. Allied adaptation, intelligence breakthroughs, enhanced air coverage, improved escort tactics, began to render wolf pack attacks less effective. The psychological strain on the German crews intensified as each patrol carried a higher probability of destruction. The Atlantic, which had once been a domain of German predation, had become a theater where the hunter risked becoming the hunted. This period also saw the integration of intelligence into operational decision-making at an unprecedented scale. Information derived from Enigma decrypts allowed the Allies to reroute convoys, concentrate escorts, and anticipate U-boat positions. Signals intelligence became a force multiplier, turning the strategic advantage gradually in favor of the Allies. Every successful application of intelligence not only saved ships and lives, but also degraded German morale, creating a feedback loop where experience, adaptation, and knowledge compounded into tangible operational gains. By mid-1944, the cumulative effect of these developments was unmistakable. Convoy losses had decreased significantly, supply lines were stabilizing, and Britain's war economy had a reliable flow of resources. The Atlantic, which had once threatened national survival, had been largely tamed, yet this hard-won control came at a staggering cost. Tens of thousands of merchant seamen, naval personnel, and airmen had perished. Thousands of ships had been lost. Every advance had been paid for in human lives, and the memory of near defeat remained vivid in the minds of commanders, planners, and civilians. The strategic implications of this victory were profound. Secure transatlantic supply lines allowed Britain and its allies to plan and execute major operations, including the D-Day landings and subsequent campaigns in Western Europe. The lessons of the Atlantic informed broader military doctrine, emphasizing the integration of intelligence, technology, and logistics in modern warfare. The battle had demonstrated that control of the seas, though often invisible and unglamorous, was a prerequisite for global military power. Without the survival of these convoys, the entire trajectory of the war might have been irrevocably altered. Yet the narrative of survival in the Atlantic also underscores the thin margins by which history often turns. Britain's near collapse was not due to a single failure but a confluence of challenges: inadequate early defenses, the overwhelming efficiency of U-boat wolf packs, extreme weather, technological limitations, and the sheer vastness of the ocean. Each factor alone might have been manageable, but combined, they posed an existential threat. The eventual triumph was the result of relentless adaptation, the courage of ordinary people, and the coordination of strategy, intelligence, and industrial power. Even as the Allies gained ascendancy, the human stories continued to shape the battle's legacy. Accounts from lifeboats, rescue operations, and convoy encounters reveal extraordinary acts of bravery and endurance. Survivors spoke of navigating icy waters for hours, rescuing comrades, and maintaining morale under conditions that defied endurance. These narratives, often overshadowed by grander operational histories, remain a critical lens through which the scale and intensity of the Atlantic struggle can be fully appreciated. In retrospect, the Battle of the Atlantic demonstrates the interplay between strategic vision and human resilience. Britain's survival depended not solely on the decisions of commanders, but also on the cumulative actions of thousands of individuals confronting immediate and existential threats. It was a war of endurance as much as of firepower, a struggle in which every day, every crossing, and every convoy mattered. The Atlantic, with its vast, unforgiving waters, had become a proving ground where the limits of courage, technology, and organization were tested and ultimately extended. By the closing months of 1944, the Atlantic had been secured to a degree that seemed almost miraculous given the scale of earlier losses. The U-boat threat was still present, but no longer existential. Britain's lifelines were largely intact, allowing the nation to participate fully in the liberation of Europe and to support the final phases of the war across multiple theaters. The victory in the Atlantic, hard-won and costly, became a defining element of Allied success, underscoring the critical importance of maritime logistics, intelligence, and sustained human effort in the outcome of the Second World War. The lessons of the Atlantic extended far beyond the immediate tactical and operational sphere. They reshaped the understanding of modern warfare, highlighting the interplay between logistics, intelligence, and human endurance. Britain's survival was not merely a result of naval engagements or air patrols, but a comprehensive orchestration of resources, planning, and innovation. The convoy system, initially a reluctant compromise, had evolved into a sophisticated instrument of war. Routes were optimized, escorts were organized into specialized groups, and intelligence from code breaking was fully integrated into operational decisions. Every aspect of this vast logistical operation carried the weight of national survival. Human stories continued to define the narrative. Merchant seamen, whose names rarely appeared in dispatches, performed daily acts of heroism. They navigated treacherous seas, repaired damaged vessels under fire, and rescued fellow sailors from icy waters. Their perseverance ensured that factories remained supplied, cities were fed, and armies could operate abroad. Equally, naval personnel on corvettes and destroyers executed complex anti-submarine maneuvers, often in the most extreme conditions. The line between success and catastrophe was narrow, and every decision carried immediate consequences. Courage was measured in hours, not days, and survival was never guaranteed. For German forces, the Atlantic increasingly became a theater of attrition without reward. U-boat losses mounted as Allied tactics improved. Wolf pack attacks, once devastating, were disrupted by intelligence-led convoy routing and coordinated air-sea patrols. The introduction of long-range aircraft closed the mid-Atlantic gap, forcing submarines to operate submerged for longer periods, slowing progress and increasing vulnerability. Experienced crews were lost, and replacements could not match their proficiency. Donitz's initial strategy, brilliant in theory, began to falter under the relentless pressure of adaptation and industrial scale. The very tactics that had nearly starved Britain now faced a counterweight in the Allies, growing technological and organizational capacity. The integration of air power was particularly transformative. Aircraft equipped with radar could detect U-boats at night and in poor visibility, dramatically reducing the element of surprise that submarines had relied upon. Escort carriers extended this capability across wider sections of the ocean, providing continuous air cover that constrained U-boat operations. Pilots flew missions that tested endurance and skill, often operating at the limits of their aircraft's range. Each successful patrol not only protected convoys, but also inflicted losses on enemy submarines, gradually tipping the balance in favor of the Allies. By late 1944, Britain's confidence in maintaining transatlantic supply lines had been restored. The worst months of the tonnage war were behind, though the memory of near collapse lingered. Operational planning now incorporated lessons learned through harsh experience, the importance of redundancy, the integration of intelligence, the necessity of technological adaptation, and the critical role of human endurance. Every successful crossing reinforced the understanding that modern warfare was not solely determined by frontline combat, but by the ability to sustain, adapt, and innovate under pressure. This period also highlighted the interdependence of Allied forces. Canada's naval contributions, American shipbuilding, and British industrial and operational coordination formed a triad that ensured resilience. Convoys were no longer isolated national endeavors but international operations, reflecting a cooperative approach that magnified effectiveness. Intelligence sharing, technological coordination, and industrial synergy became as critical as tactics at sea, demonstrating that victory in the Atlantic relied on both individual courage and multinational cooperation. The human dimension remained central. Sailors continued to endure freezing seas, storms, and the psychological strain of constant threat. For many, survival was a daily negotiation, requiring vigilance, training, and extraordinary resilience. Life aboard escort vessels was cramped, noisy, and exhausting, yet crews performed complex maneuvers with precision under pressure. Their efforts ensured that merchant ships, the lifeblood of Britain, reached their destinations, sustaining both the population and the war effort abroad. Each voyage represented not only a tactical success, but a reaffirmation of human perseverance in the face of relentless adversity. For the German Kriegsmarine, the story was one of diminishing returns. U-boats that had once operated with near impunity now faced detection and destruction. Experienced commanders were lost, and the operational tempo could no longer be maintained without significant attrition. The psychological impact on crews, combined with the increasingly hostile operational environment, undermined the effectiveness of Donitz's strategy. The Atlantic, which had been a domain of German predation, had been transformed into a contested space where the Allies exerted growing control. By 1945, the Atlantic was firmly under Allied command. Convoys reached ports with minimal losses, air and sea patrols operated effectively across the entire ocean, and the threat of mass submarine attacks had been neutralized. Britain's survival, once precarious, was now assured, enabling the nation to participate fully in final operations on the European continent. The cumulative efforts of sailors, pilots, intelligence analysts, and industrial workers had converted near catastrophe into strategic advantage. The Atlantic, once a place of existential peril, had become a symbol of resilience, adaptation, and the decisive impact of sustained human and industrial effort. The story of Britain nearly losing the Atlantic War encapsulates a fundamental truth of modern conflict. Survival often depends not on decisive battles alone, but on the ability to endure, adapt, and innovate under relentless pressure. The Atlantic demonstrated the convergence of human courage, technological advancement, and strategic foresight. It highlighted the interplay between individual acts of heroism and systemic planning, between industrial output and operational flexibility, and between human endurance and technological ingenuity. This vast, unforgiving theatre tested every facet of Britain's capacity to wage war, and in doing so, it became a defining crucible of the Second World War. Even in retrospect, the margin of survival is striking. Britain's near collapse in the Atlantic was not a theoretical risk, it was a daily reality, measured in lives lost, ships sunk, and convoys imperiled. Only through relentless effort, ingenuity, and courage did the nation endure. The men and women who contributed to this struggle, whether aboard merchant ships, escort vessels, or in intelligence centers, forged the backbone of a victory that allowed Britain to survive, to fight, and ultimately to contribute decisively to the liberation of Europe. By the final months of the war in Europe, the Atlantic had transformed from a theater of near destruction into a showcase of Allied mastery. Britain's survival depended not only on its industrial resilience, but on the countless small, cumulative actions of individuals who braved storms, enemy fire, and exhaustion. Each convoy, each escort mission, and each reconnaissance flight contributed to a broader narrative, the assertion of control over one of the most strategically vital oceans in history. The lessons learned about logistics, intelligence, and human endurance would resonate far beyond the Second World War, shaping naval strategy for decades to come. The Battle of the Atlantic, though largely invisible to the public eye, had been as decisive as any land campaign. By securing the flow of supplies, Britain maintained the capacity to feed its population, equip its forces, and project power across multiple theaters. The narrative is one of constant adaptation, technological innovation, tactical evolution, and relentless perseverance combined to overcome a threat that had, for months, seemed insurmountable. It is a story of near defeat transformed into resilience, a testament to human ingenuity and the will to survive. Even with the Atlantic largely secured, the war was far from over, and the lessons of near defeat remained etched in the minds of both strategists and sailors. The months of relentless pressure had shown that victory depended as much on endurance as on firepower. Britain's experience highlighted that modern warfare was multidimensional. It required coordination between intelligence, technology, industry, and human courage. The survival of the nation had hinged on this complex interplay, where every convoy, every aircraft patrol, and every shipyard worker played a role in an invisible but decisive battle. The resilience of the merchant navy became emblematic of national perseverance. For civilians, each shipment that arrived safely meant bread, fuel, and hope. For sailors, it was a daily confrontation with the limits of physical and mental endurance. Nights were spent navigating icy waters, alert to every shadow and every sonar ping. Storms could scatter ships and compromise escort formations, making routine crossings into battles of survival. Yet despite exhaustion and constant danger, the crews pressed on, guided by discipline, training, and a shared understanding of the stakes. Their actions formed the backbone of Britain's war effort, bridging the gap between industrial output and operational necessity. Air power continued to amplify Allied effectiveness. Patrol aircraft and escort carriers not only reduced U-boat effectiveness, but also introduced a psychological element, forcing German crews to operate under constant threat from above. Long-range patrols filled the once deadly mid-Atlantic gap, making coordinated wolf pack attacks increasingly risky. U-boat commanders had to calculate their moves carefully, knowing that a single misstep could lead to destruction. The Atlantic, which had once been a realm of German dominance, now tested their resilience under conditions that favored detection and counterattack. Strategic coordination reached a new level of sophistication. Convoy routing relied on intelligence from decrypted communications, meteorological data, and tactical assessments. Escort groups were organized into flexible, responsive units capable of aggressive countermeasures. These methods, refined over years of bitter experience, allowed Britain to protect vital supply lines with increasing efficiency. While losses still occurred, the pattern of attrition had shifted decisively. The Allies could now impose conditions on engagements, rather than merely reacting to the enemy's movements, marking a crucial turning point in maritime warfare. The human experience remained central to the narrative. Accounts from surviving seamen describe moments of extraordinary courage, managing damaged vessels while under attack, rescuing shipmates from icy waters, and maintaining morale under relentless stress. These acts, often overshadowed by broader operational histories, were essential to sustaining Britain's logistical lifelines. The cumulative effect of countless such moments created a resilience that statistics alone cannot capture. Human endurance, amplified by technological and tactical innovation, had become a decisive factor in the Atlantic struggle. German U-boat crews faced growing challenges. Losses of experienced personnel and technological countermeasures undermined operational effectiveness. Wolf pack tactics, once devastatingly effective, were increasingly disrupted by intelligence-led convoy routing and air-sea coordination. Dönitz's doctrine of attritional pressure, while still theoretically sound, encountered diminishing returns against a foe that had adapted rapidly and decisively. The psychological strain on German crews intensified as the Atlantic became increasingly hostile and unpredictable. The hunter had become, in many ways, the hunted. By late 1944, Britain's mastery of the Atlantic allowed strategic focus to shift elsewhere. With supply lines largely secure, resources could be allocated to the liberation of Western Europe and campaigns in distant theaters. The victory in the Atlantic, though unglamorous, had been transformative. It demonstrated that endurance, adaptation, and integration of intelligence and technology could overcome formidable threats, preserving the lifeblood of a nation under existential pressure. The lessons were clear. Modern warfare demanded not just combat prowess, but resilience, planning, and the ability to innovate under relentless adversity. The narrative of near defeat and eventual mastery underscores the thin margins upon which survival often rests. Britain's early vulnerability in the Atlantic illustrates how critical maritime control is to national survival, while the eventual triumph highlights the effectiveness of coordinated human effort, technological innovation, and industrial capacity. The Atlantic War was more than a series of battles. It was a continuous test of endurance, adaptability, and strategic foresight, in which every day and every convoy mattered. Even as the European theatre drew toward its conclusion, the human and operational lessons of the Atlantic remained vital. Commanders, sailors, and civilians had collectively endured a trial by ocean and steel, transforming near catastrophe into a foundation for sustained Allied success. The Atlantic had become not only a battleground but a proving ground for the resilience of a nation, and the effectiveness of coordinated, intelligent, and courageous effort. The culmination of Britain's struggle in the Atlantic was not a single dramatic battle, but a relentless, grinding series of engagements, innovations, and adaptations. By early 1945, the danger of U-boat dominance had largely passed, yet the cost of survival remained evident in the human toll and the vessels lost to storm, torpedo, and shell. Every crossing had demanded precision, vigilance, and courage. Every convoy that reached port intact represented not only a logistical victory, but a triumph of endurance and coordinated effort over relentless adversity. The Atlantic had become a theater where planning, technology, and human fortitude intersected with lethal consequence. The success in the Atlantic underscored the transformative power of intelligence. Bletchley Park's codebreakers had provided information that allowed commanders to anticipate attacks, reroute convoys, and focus resources effectively. Their contributions, often invisible to those at sea, were instrumental in reducing losses and frustrating the German submarine campaign. This integration of intelligence into operational decision-making marked a paradigm shift in naval warfare, highlighting the importance of information as a force multiplier. The story of the Atlantic was no longer solely about ships and guns. It was also about the unseen hands guiding movements, predicting threats, and shaping outcomes with calculated precision. At sea, technological innovation continued to enhance effectiveness. Radar-equipped aircraft, improved sonar systems, and the Hedgehog anti-submarine weapon transformed the nature of naval engagement. Submarines could no longer operate with impunity. The element of surprise had diminished. Escorts trained in coordinated hunting tactics could pursue threats with lethal efficiency. The Atlantic, once dominated by stealth and fear, had become a controlled environment where the Allies could impose operational conditions. Each advancement increased survivability for convoys and inflicted further losses on the enemy, demonstrating the cumulative power of adaptation over time. The human dimension remained central. Sailors, gunners, and airmen faced conditions that tested physical limits and psychological resilience. Storms, ice, and relentless fatigue were constant adversaries. Merchant mariners, often civilians serving in extraordinary circumstances, performed acts of courage and endurance that ensured supplies reached ports. Naval crews executed complex anti-submarine maneuvers under fire, often with limited rest and exposure to harsh elements. The interplay of discipline, training, and instinct was critical, forming the foundation upon which broader strategic success rested. Britain's survival was as much a story of individual courage as of industrial or technological achievement. German crews faced mounting challenges. Experienced personnel were lost faster than they could be replaced, and U-boat operations were increasingly constrained by intelligence and technology. Dönitz's wolf pack tactics, once devastating, were now less effective, and operational losses mounted. The psychological strain of prolonged exposure to a hostile environment eroded morale. The Atlantic, which had been a hunting ground, had become a perilous arena where error or misfortune could result in immediate destruction. German commanders were forced to adjust their strategy continually, yet the cumulative effect of Allied adaptation made success ever more elusive. By mid-1945, Britain could claim mastery of the Atlantic. Supply lines were secure, and the logistical foundation of the Allied war effort was firmly established. The near collapse of 1940–42 had been transformed into a controlled, resilient system, where every convoy could rely on the integration of intelligence, technology, and skilled personnel. This victory, though often overlooked in popular narratives of the war, was decisive. It ensured that Britain could sustain its population, project power overseas, and contribute effectively to the final phases of the conflict. The survival of a nation hinged upon the endurance of its sailors, the insight of its planners, and the ingenuity of its engineers. The narrative of Britain nearly losing the Atlantic War is a lesson in the fragility and resilience of modern states. The margin between survival and collapse had been extraordinarily thin, and only a combination of courage, innovation, and industrial might preserved Britain from strategic disaster. It is a story of endurance under relentless pressure, where human effort, intelligence, and technological adaptation converge to overcome a seemingly insurmountable threat. The Atlantic, once a theater of near destruction, became a proving ground for the integration of multiple elements of modern warfare, demonstrating that survival often depends on the ability to anticipate, adapt, and persevere. Finally, the Battle of the Atlantic stands as a testament to collective effort and resilience. The courage of seamen and aviators, the ingenuity of engineers and codebreakers, and the determination of civilians on the home front coalesced into a force that overcame a dire strategic threat. Britain's near defeat had been averted, but only through sustained commitment, meticulous planning, and extraordinary human endurance. The Atlantic had tested every aspect of strategy, technology, and morale, leaving a legacy of lessons that would shape naval and military thinking for generations to come. Even after the decisive shift in the Battle of the Atlantic, vigilance remained essential. Britain's survival had depended on the delicate balance of protection, production, and endurance, and complacency could have proven fatal. Convoys continued to traverse vast distances under the watchful eyes of escort vessels and patrol aircraft. Each crossing reinforced the importance of coordination and precision. The Atlantic, though no longer dominated by the German U-boat threat, remained a theater where weather, mechanical failure, and human error could produce catastrophe. The lessons of near defeat had instilled a culture of vigilance and adaptability that permeated naval strategy and operational planning. The psychological impact of the Atlantic struggle extended far beyond the sailors who faced peril daily. Civilians endured rationing, shortages, and uncertainty, relying on the constant arrival of vital supplies. The very fabric of British society was intertwined with the success of the convoys. Every loaf of bread, every ton of fuel, every critical shipment of raw material depended on the combined courage of sailors, intelligence analysts, and industrial workers. This interdependence underscored a profound truth. In modern total war, victory is inseparable from the endurance, courage, and coordination of an entire society. Technological and tactical innovation continued to define the later stages of the Atlantic War. The integration of sonar, radar, and aircraft surveillance created a layered defense system that was both adaptive and formidable. Escort carriers extended air coverage deep into previously vulnerable zones, while advanced anti-submarine weaponry allowed surface vessels to take the initiative against submerged threats. The Atlantic, once a domain of stealth and unpredictability, became increasingly controllable, with intelligence and coordination determining outcomes as much as firepower. These developments demonstrated the evolving nature of naval warfare, where anticipation and adaptation became as decisive as the ability to engage the enemy directly. The human cost, however, remained sobering. Thousands of sailors, airmen, and merchant mariners had perished over the course of the conflict. Each casualty was a reminder of the stakes involved and of the narrow margin by which Britain had survived. The psychological strain on survivors was immense, and their perseverance under constant threat exemplified extraordinary resilience. Their efforts ensured not only the success of individual convoys, but the survival of a nation, highlighting the critical role of human courage in shaping strategic outcomes. For Germany, the opportunity to sever Britain's lifelines had passed. U-boat losses, combined with the cumulative effect of Allied innovation and intelligence, had neutralized the threat that once had the potential to starve a nation. Dönitz's strategy, predicated on sustained attrition and tactical ingenuity, was rendered largely ineffective against a foe capable of rapid adaptation. The Atlantic, which had once symbolized German operational dominance, had become a theater where their influence waned under the weight of coordinated Allied effort and relentless technological progression. By the closing months of the war, Britain's mastery of the Atlantic was unquestionable. Supply lines were secure, convoy losses were minimized, and the industrial output of the nation was reliably supported. The near collapse of the early war years now seemed a distant memory, yet its lessons remained deeply ingrained. The experience underscored the importance of preparation, coordination, and resilience in modern warfare. Victory in the Atlantic had been hard-won, shaped by both extraordinary human courage and the meticulous integration of intelligence, technology, and industrial capacity. The story of Britain nearly losing the Atlantic War is a profound study in endurance, adaptation, and the interplay of human and technological factors. It demonstrates that the survival of a nation in total war is contingent on far more than battlefield victories. It depends on the seamless integration of strategy, intelligence, production, and courage under pressure. The Atlantic, once a place of existential threat, became a crucible in which the resilience and ingenuity of a nation were tested and ultimately proven. The Battle of the Atlantic stands as one of the most decisive and instructive struggles of the Second World War. It illustrates the fragility of survival in the face of strategic vulnerability, the power of collective human effort, and the essential role of adaptation and innovation in warfare. Britain's near defeat became a narrative of triumph through perseverance, a testament to the courage of those who faced the sea, the storms, and the enemy with unwavering determination. In the end, the Atlantic was not merely a body of water, it was the lifeline of a nation, and its defense was the measure of Britain's endurance, resolve, and ingenuity. As the war in Europe drew closer to its conclusion, the Battle of the Atlantic remained a living testament to the resilience of Britain and her allies. The once precarious flow of supplies had become a reliable lifeline, ensuring that food, fuel, weapons, and raw materials reached not only the British Isles, but also the staging grounds for liberation campaigns on the continent. Convoys crossed the Atlantic with confidence born of years of trial, yet the memory of near defeat served as a constant reminder of what had been at stake. Each ship that reached port was more than cargo, it was a symbol of endurance, courage, and national survival. The human stories continued to resonate, illustrating the scale and intensity of the struggle. Sailors navigated dangerous waters, often in freezing storms, maintaining watch with unflinching resolve. Merchant mariners faced enemy torpedoes, storms, and mechanical failures, yet their determination never wavered. Air crews on long-range patrols braved treacherous seas, locating and deterring U-boat threats with precision. Each individual, whether a soldier, sailor, airman, or civilian worker supporting the effort from home, contributed to a complex chain of survival. The Battle of the Atlantic was, in essence, a story of human endurance magnified by necessity, where every action carried consequences for millions ashore. Technological innovation remained a defining factor in Allied success. The integration of radar, sonar, and air reconnaissance had transformed naval engagements, turning a theater of stealth and uncertainty into one where detection and counterattack could be coordinated with deadly efficiency. Escort carriers, equipped with aircraft capable of patrolling vast stretches of ocean, closed the mid-Atlantic gap that had once given U-boats near-total freedom. Depth charges and hedgehog mortars enhanced anti-submarine lethality, allowing small escort vessels to neutralize threats once thought untouchable. Each technological advance reduced risk, saved lives, and contributed to the cumulative mastery of the Atlantic. Strategic coordination reached its apex. Intelligence from codebreakers, combined with meteorological and operational data, allowed commanders to anticipate threats and orchestrate complex conv operations. Hunter-killer groups pursued submarines proactively while escort formations adapted to evolving conditions at sea. Convoys became highly organized, their defense a seamless integration of air, sea, and intelligence assets. The Atlantic, which had once been an arena of chaos and terror, had been transformed into a theater of controlled operations, demonstrating the remarkable adaptability of the Allies under extreme pressure. The psychological toll on those who served in the Atlantic cannot be overstated. Constant exposure to danger, harsh environmental conditions, and prolonged separation from home tested the limits of human endurance. Sailors maintained discipline and focus under relentless strain, performing complex maneuvers in freezing temperatures, heavy seas, and under the constant threat of enemy attack. Merchant mariners faced similar challenges, often working in isolation, vulnerable to storms and torpedoes alike. The courage displayed by these individuals was fundamental to the survival of Britain, and their resilience became the invisible backbone of Allied victory. For the German Kriegsmarine, the Atlantic had become increasingly inhospitable. U-boat operations suffered from losses of experienced crews, growing intelligence advantages held by the Allies, and technological innovations that rendered their tactics less effective. Wolf pack operations, once devastating, now faced superior detection and coordinated response. The psychological strain on U-boat crews intensified as the once dominant predator was forced to adapt to a theater where the Allies increasingly dictated the terms of engagement. By the final months of the war, German efforts in the Atlantic were largely reactive, a shadow of the campaign that had once threatened Britain's very survival. Britain's near collapse in the Atlantic War serves as a reminder of the precariousness of survival under total war conditions. The nation's eventual mastery of the Atlantic was neither inevitable nor easily achieved. It was the product of intelligence, innovation, endurance, and collective effort on an unprecedented scale. Every convoy, every patrol, every technological breakthrough contributed to the survival of a nation. The Atlantic War demonstrated that modern conflict is as much about sustaining life and logistics as it is about battlefield heroics, and that victory often hinges on the ability to endure, adapt, and innovate under relentless pressure. By the war's end, the Battle of the Atlantic had secured its place as one of the most critical campaigns of the Second World War. The once dominant U-boat threat had been neutralized, supply lines were stabilized, and Britain's logistical lifelines remained intact. The strategic, technological, and human lessons of the Atlantic would shape military thought for generations, offering enduring insights into the interplay of endurance, adaptation, and coordination in modern warfare. Britain had survived not through luck, but through the relentless determination of its people, the courage of its sailors, and the ingenuity of its planners. As Europe witnessed the final collapse of Nazi Germany, the Battle of the Atlantic stood as a testament to the extraordinary endurance and ingenuity that had preserved Britain through its darkest hours. The ocean, once a place of constant peril and near catastrophe, had become a symbol of resilience. Britain's ability to adapt, innovate, and sustain itself across thousands of miles of open water ensured not only its survival, but the success of the broader Allied war effort. Every convoy that reached port, every submarine neutralized, and every storm weathered contributed to a narrative of survival against overwhelming odds. The human dimension of this struggle cannot be overstated. Sailors, airmen, and merchant mariners endured freezing seas, relentless storms, and the omnipresent threat of enemy attack. They navigated mechanical failures, endured prolonged separations from loved ones, and faced the psychological strain of constant vigilance. Their courage and perseverance formed the backbone of a nation's survival. Onshore, civilians supported the war effort with determination, sustaining industry, and maintaining morale in the face of rationing, bombing, and uncertainty. The Battle of the Atlantic was a war fought not only at sea, but across the entirety of British society. Technological and tactical innovation had been decisive. Radar and sonar detection, aircraft patrols, convoy escort formations, and anti-submarine weaponry collectively neutralized the once feared U-boat threat. Intelligence from code breaking allowed commanders to anticipate and counter enemy actions, turning the ocean into a domain where Allied control could be asserted incrementally. Each advancement amplified the effectiveness of human effort, creating a force multiplier that shifted the balance decisively. The Atlantic, once a theater of fear, had been transformed into a controlled operational environment where survival and success became achievable. Strategic coordination and multinational cooperation reinforced this transformation. Canada's naval contributions, American shipbuilding, and British operational leadership formed an integrated system that allowed the Allies to dominate the Atlantic. Convoy routing, air support, and hunter-killer groups operated seamlessly together, reflecting the extraordinary planning and organizational discipline required to maintain the lifelines of a nation at war. The Atlantic War demonstrated that modern conflict is fought not only with weapons, but with coordination, foresight, and sustained collective effort. Reflecting on the Battle of the Atlantic, the stakes of near defeat become starkly apparent. Britain had survived, but only by a narrow margin. The nation's industrial, naval, and human resources were tested to the limit, and the consequences of failure would have been catastrophic. Each convoy, each successful patrol, each act of endurance represented a battle won against both the elements and a determined enemy. The cumulative effect of these countless actions preserved not only Britain's survival, but the operational foundation upon which the final victory in Europe was built. Ultimately, the Atlantic Campaign illustrates a fundamental truth of warfare. Survival often hinges on endurance, innovation, and coordination. The men and women who labored at sea, in the air, and on the home front created a network of resilience that transformed near defeat into strategic advantage. Britain's mastery of the Atlantic allowed the nation to sustain its population, project power abroad, and participate decisively in the liberation of Europe. The story is one of courage, adaptability, and the integration of human, technological, and strategic resources under relentless pressure. The Battle of the Atlantic remains one of the most consequential and instructive campaigns of the Second World War. It demonstrates the interplay between individual courage and systemic coordination, between technological innovation and human endurance. It highlights the razor-thin margin between survival and collapse, and the extraordinary lengths to which a nation must go to maintain its lifelines under existential threat. Britain had nearly lost the Atlantic War, but through courage, ingenuity, and resilience, it endured, ensuring not only its own survival but contributing decisively to the eventual defeat of Nazi Germany. In the end, the Atlantic was not merely a theater of war, it was a crucible in which the limits of endurance, strategy, and human will were tested and proven. Britain's survival and the Allied victory that followed rested on the courage of those who dared to face the storms, the submarines, and the darkness of the deep. The Atlantic War remains a story of near collapse transformed into triumph, a testament to the resilience, ingenuity, and determination that define the human spirit in the face of existential threat.